And welcome to Live Academy, the virtual design learning platform by MEO Middle East Architectural Lab. My name is Riyad Joucka. I'll be moderating today's lecture. And for the first semester, this is the last lecture of the semester. We have 2 more classes for you to sign up for. So if you haven't already, please sign up to these classes before we run out of places. It's been a great experience working on this first semester of Live Academy, our first time doing it. And because of your amazing attendance from such a wide array of countries, it has become this decentralized online platform attracting people to share knowledge and exchange their experience in computational design. Today's lecture is probably the most anticipated one, mainly because Alvin has become an international figure in architecture and computational design. My interest personally of his work started with the AA Pavilion C space, which he has built in 2002 and still to this date offers an intriguing precedent to what could be done with digital tools. His CV is enormous. I will spare you going through all of it. It's filled with accomplishments, exhibitions, publications, and talks, which he has amassed over years. Very excited for Alvin to show us his latest work in practice in academia, as I'm sure you all are. May I remind you that Q&A will be taken 1 hour into this session, and you could either type your question in the Q&A box, so that small button under your window there, or you could use the raise hand tool and we will promote you as panelists and you can ask your question live to Alvin. Alvin Huang is a Los Angeles-based architect with a global profile. He is an award-winning architect, designer, and educator specializing in the integrated application of material performance, emergent design technologies, and digital fabrication in contemporary architecture practice. He founded his architecture practice, Synthesis Design and Architecture, in 2011. And since then, his design work has been published and exhibited widely and has gained international recognition with over 40 distinctions at local, national, and international levels. Please welcome the man selected as one of the 50 global innovators under the age of 50 by Images Publishing in 2015, who was featured as Next Progressive by Architect Magazine in 2014 and named Time Magazine's 25 Best Inventors of 2013. Alvin Huang, welcome to Live Academy.
All right, well, thanks, Riyad, for that extended introduction, and it's a little bit embarrassing, but I'll take it. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for being here. I have to say it's a little bit odd to be kind of lecturing or talking to myself in my living room, or actually my dining room. My wife and my daughter are sitting behind me right now having their breakfast. But it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you right now. Title of my talk, Technology, Technique, Techne, Creation, Contingency, and Culture. And so I think it's actually those last 3 words I want to really focus on, which is creation, contingency, and culture. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But really what we're talking about here is these 3 quotes, and these 3 quotes are kind of ways I'm framing the way I'm looking at those 3 terms. The first quote comes from an architect by the name of Florian Eidenberg from a practice called Soil or Soil. And he really talks about architecture as a place for ideas and ideas as an opportunity to think about alternatives. And then in the middle, we have a quote, which is one of my favorites, from Cedric Price in 1966, where he asks, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And then finally, in the bottom, we have a quote from Benjamin Bratton, where he talks about, and this is an article he wrote about the problem with TED Talks and thinking about kind of contemporary culture and how technology and culture merge. And in this case, what I guess I want to start to talk off with is how technology and culture are actually the same thing. And these are 2 buildings that most of you, even though you may have not been to Los Angeles or may have, I'm sure most of you as architect students or architects are familiar with both of these buildings. On the left, we have the Broad by Diller Scofidio Renfro, and on the right, we have the Disney Concert Hall by Frank Gehry Partners. What we can see is that these 2 projects are across from one another and are 2 landmark projects. But what we don't see is that on its opening year, the Broad had 820,000 plus visitors, which is about 3 times more than they had expected to have. The average age of those visitors was 32, which puts it at 14 years younger than the average age, national average in the United States for museum But maybe what's most important is that 25% of those visitors discovered the museum through social media, meaning they didn't know about the art, they didn't know about the architecture. They only knew that their friends had gone, and so they decided to go. And so that same photograph right there was actually posted to my own social media, to my own Instagram, while I was standing in that line waiting for the opening of the museum. And while I was standing there posting this photograph, I looked around looking at everybody else and wondered to myself why it felt like I was the only person that was not dressed up to go to the museum. And then once I got inside, I realized it's because I was one of the few people that was not there to take photographs of myself. And so if you look about these images, these are all taken as the kind of top graded photographs that the geotech location for the Broad. It's actually not unique to the Broad. If you go next door, Disney Concert Hall, the kind of photos that are assessed as the top photographs are also all kind of selfies and images where the architecture becomes the backdrop. The architecture becomes the kind of cachet for positioning one's place in the world or for identifying one's experience. And so what we're seeing is that Instagram's really changing the way we view the world. I'm not going to go through all of these statistics. They're all kind of self-explanatory, but really what we can see is that the way that we're consuming the world around us is significantly changing because of technology, and it's producing its own form of culture. And that culture now values experience more than it does goods, right? And so experience becomes the kind of luxury item that, let's say, this new technology-informed culture is actually craving. So in the end, if what we are producing as architects is containers for experiences, then what makes an experience memorable? Well, this is actually scientifically proven by a researcher by the name of Don Enright, and he identifies fulfillment, novelty, effect, and rehearsal as the things that make an experience memorable. And I guess that asks the question, how do you design a memorable experience? So if fulfillment is, as defined by Don Enright, the ability for the thing that the thing that is in question to actually do what it's supposed to do, meaning if it's a meal, it's a good meal, then we can cross that off the list because if we're saying that as a building, it needs to do what it needs to do. That's kind of a given, right? Like our buildings need to work. They need to actually perform at the level that they were intended to perform. They need to be structurally sound, waterproof, and programmatically organized. Rehearsal at the end is really like the things that we will take with us and remember from those experiences, whether those are scars or stories or photographs or Instagram posts in this case. But the thing that we can maybe concentrate on is the two middle ones, novelty and effect. Novelty means that the thing that is in question as the experience at hand actually has something unique about it, something special, something that goes beyond what we would normally expect in that situation. And architecture and design can really do that. And then 3 is effect, meaning the design or the experience has to connect with one person, connect with a person and connect with them in a way that allows them to remember it. So if these things are packaged and bundled into beginning to think about architecture and many of the advances that we're now experiencing through technology and this kind of evolution of culture, this is one of the quotes that really motivates me, which is, technology is the answer, but what is the question? Cedric Price wrote this in 1966. And I think it's important to note that 1966 was a time of absolute turmoil, politically, socially, culturally. But that turmoil was one of complete progress. And this act of questioning and thinking of technology as a solution, but an emphasis on what the questions that technology could answer is really important. And the way I like to think about that is also through pairing it with a quote from one of my mentors, Hanif Kara, of the structural engineering firm AKT. He once said this to me while we were on a panel, and he said, great engineers come up with great solutions. Great architects come up with great problems. And I know he said it as somewhat of a joke, but I really took it to heart, and I think it's a very, very important way of framing design, which is we can't have really interesting solutions unless we have really interesting questions. And the job of the designer is actually to question and actually to challenge. So these are some of the questions that motivate the work that I'm engaged in. These are questions that are more disciplinary or more specific to the intrinsic body of work rather than the individual projects. But then there's also a set of questions that motivate each project. And so what I'm going to present to you is a series of projects. All of them are going to be presented or framed through a series of questions. But what I'm also really interested in is this evolution of tool to technique to Techne. And this is something I've written about extensively. Thinking about tools as things that are, in this case, as defined by the saxophone, something that allows us to do something that we couldn't do without it, right? So the saxophone allows humans to play music or produce sounds that they wouldn't be able to produce without the instrument. However, technique is the evolution of that tool to become a way of doing something that is based off of skill and expertise that allows us to replicate known effects or known results or consequences. But the real beauty here is when it reaches a level of Techne. And Techne is a term that comes from ancient Greece and is invented by Aristotle in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about Techne as the kind of principles of art or craft that are employed in making or producing something. And this doesn't have to be something physical, it could be something intellectual, it can be something as a service. He talks about doctors having a Techne, carpenters having a Techne. But what it means is that you have perfected the use of a tool or the use of a technique to the point that you are able to think with it. And so that level of thinking allows you to work and develop an intuition on how to manipulate that. And I think that's the important way that we need to think about tool and technique in terms of how we as architects can leverage these things to actually use them to provide answers to the questions that we're asking. One of the first questions I want to talk about is how we redefine craft in a post-digital era. And the post-digital era, in this sense, I don't mean as when digital is over. I mean when digital is a given. And I think we're actually near that point right now, right? We don't ever talk about, the fact that we are still sending electronic mails. Emails are just a default standard way of communication. It doesn't matter that they're digital anymore. Just like working on a word processor or working on the computer is just a given. So digital fabrication stops being digital fabrication, it just is fabrication. And in the case of the 3D printer, which we're looking at here, we have a 3D printed chair, which we designed for Stratasys. And the question is, how do you design a 3D print rather than how do you 3D print a design? Right? By reversing that, then suddenly we're questioning what the 3D printer can do and using those constraints to define a series of opportunities to say, how do we maximize on the 3D printer and produce something that could be made in no other way, but also capitalizes on the way that it works. So this is a multivalent rocking chair. It has two positions, one as an upright rocker, two as a downright lounge. But it has this dense three-dimensional mesh, and its density goes all the way through, not just on the surface, but that density allows it to produce a kind of variable density that has what is known as asymptotic stability, meaning it has the stability which always finds its upright position based off of its centroid and its center of gravity, much like this punching dummy in the diagram on the left. But the other unique thing that this design does is it capitalizes on this particular printer, which has two heads. Each head has 96 nozzles. Each nozzle prints at about 16 micron, and each head can print at a different material. But because it has the 96 nozzles in each head, they can also create matrices between those, which will produce gradients. And in this case, a gradient between a rigid, hard, opaque blue and a translucent, white, clear, soft white. And that kind of variable density and variable material performance we also think of as a way to think about how performance can be involved. much like the human bone, where the human bone we think of as a solid kind of material system is actually a variable density, a system of variable density, but a system of variable density that over time has evolved so that those areas that have the greatest principal stress, which is what those diagrams on the top indicate, have the areas of the most material. And where we don't need the material, then we can actually eliminate material, thus making the bone as strong as it needs to be, but as light as it can be. And so we're running those similar kind of principal stress studies of our chair, as you see in the diagrams on the bottom, and then using those diagrams to produce a kind of heat map based off of both an external kind of understanding of ergonomics, but an internal understanding of principal stress using a sphere packing algorithm to pack that volume and attract based off of redistribute those spheres according to those heat maps, which produces using those spheres to find the centers of a three-dimensional Voronoi pattern, using that three-dimensional Voronoi pattern to then to produce this kind of wire lattice. And then that wire lattice is broken down into a series of gradient steps so that it can be printed in 10 different gradients of the material condition. And then here we see the 3D printed chair being produced. As you can see on the top left, when it's originally being printed, it almost gets printed as a kind of solid block. It's dipped into an acid, or dipped into a bath, and the support material is removed and then gets assembled by a team of technicians. Here we see the chair in its final form. But what we were really happy with the result of the chair, what we weren't so happy with was the cost. When we realized that the chair actually cost about $18,000 to produce, trust me, we didn't pay for it ourselves, but the cost of the chair was so exorbitant, it really made us question why it cost so much. And one of the things we realized was about 70 to 80% of the machine time and 70 to 80% of the material and all of the post-production was because of stuff we didn't want, meaning the support material. So we began thinking about how we could actually produce something that actually didn't have that support material. And so in this case, we started thinking about the medieval process known as corbelling. So corbelling, for those who aren't familiar, is the incremental cantilevering of brick. So by incrementally cantilevering brick based off of its center of gravity, you can produce gradients. I'm thinking of bricklaying similar to 3D printing as a form of horizontal deposition, basically adding horizontal layers one on top of itself. They're able to produce cantilevers up to a certain tipping point. And once you get to this kind of extreme angle, it needs to be intercepted by another angle, but that other angle can support that cantilever to produce an arch. So we began testing this kind of process through our own MakerBot in-house and using parametric models to fine-tune those angles and backspans and centers of gravity until we were able to test where we were having different drops of material. And then we wrote this algorithm, which is a kind of growth algorithm, which grew from a flat surface and started to split and branch, and reconnect based off of those angles and those sort of target conditions of material performance. And in the end, we were able to design this lamp, which is I'm actually sitting underneath it right now. It's right over my head. But this is the Burbuja Lamp. It's made out of 15 different pieces, each of them unique, all of them starting from an internal isodecahedron, moving towards an external sphere. The internal isodecahedron means that each piece can be printed on a flat surface, so no support is needed, and it grows towards a spherical perimeter. So the first chair cost us $18,000 to produce by our sponsors, Stratasys. This lamp had zero waste and cost us about $80 to produce. Another project which kind of looks at this idea of digital fabrication being a kind of fundamental driver for how you think about design is this Chelsea Workspace project, which we did in London. The project really kind of was an opportunity to think about how two-dimensional planar geometries could be assembled into three-dimensional form. This is Charles. He's our client. He's a private investment banker in London, and he came to us and wanted to have a home office in his flat in London, in Chelsea, and he wanted his home office to be a way that would, one, contain all of the kind of ergonomic conditions of his office, but also be a piece of art in itself, but also make the office disappear when he wasn't working at it. And so we kind of organized the entire office around the lone window in the room. We embed a series of programmatic elements, his storage, his printer, his router, etc. All of those things get kind of sculpted by a series of contours. Those contours are then skinned to produce a series of surfaces, and then those surfaces are contoured back into a series of planar geometries. Those planar geometries are then mapped against a series of horizontal Z-clips, which hang off of the back wall. The entire assembly is CNC milled, only attached at the back, so we have this kind of graphic pattern of a world map to produce lateral structural spacers towards the front. Using nesting geometry, we're able to get about 75% material efficiency in terms of embedding all of the pieces into flat sheets of laminated birch plywood. Everything is prefabricated off-site and assembled into modules, brought onto site, and dry hung onto those Z-clips. So what you see here is the final assembly. The entire thing is made out of laminated birch plywood, and then as you can see, as it moves towards the work surface, it becomes completely continuous. And if you look closely, you can see the graphic pattern of the world map, which provides the kind of lateral stability to keep those members from moving around. Charles recently put his flat up for sale, so if you want to buy a flat and get a piece of artwork, a desk as well, I believe the flat is currently up for sale, although that was a while ago. I'm assuming he sold it hopefully before this pandemic situation, because I'm assuming retail or real estate values have not done so well. Another kind of topic or interest or question is this idea about patterns, and thinking about architecture is something that is inherently and historically always been driven by patterns, mostly because of the fact that it's near impossible to produce something of the scale of an architectural building that does not have joints and is not made out of parts. And the kind of repetition of parts produces patterns by itself. But thinking about how we can use patterns as a way to be non-repetitive or variable as an interest for producing visual engagement is something that really is a driver for a lot of the work that we do. This is a project that we did for IBM Watson in San Francisco. And if you can tell by the people in the rendering, you know, it's a space for selling Watson, which is IBM's cognitive computing and machine learning service, to the .com industry and for e-commerce in particular. So what we did was, instead of thinking of the project as an opportunity to, you know, produce something that was just a symbol, we actually wanted to use Watson as part of the narrative. And so in this case, we actually worked with IBM Watson and their computer scientists to actually use Watson as a way to deep dive an analysis of 5 years of analytical data of online sales through mobile devices. And we used this to generate a heat map based off of chronology and sales and days of the week. And that three-dimensional heat map we then compressed into a two-dimensional pattern. We had exactly 6 inches of space to work with, but about 35 square meters of surface to work with. And so what we ended up doing was producing this three-dimensional height field, which gets compressed to two-dimensional heat map. A two-dimensional heat map gets sampled as both a Delaunay pattern as well as a Voronoi pattern twice, so as two layers of skin. The 2 layers of skin are separated by about 3 centimeters of space. The outer layer is CNC milled cold rolled stainless steel. The inner layer is laser cut aluminum. This allows us to have a cheaper process in the interior, but a more robust process on the exterior. When these two conditions are laid out against one another as you move around, the image starts to flicker, kind of bringing in this narrative of the fact that data is alive. And so the data not only becomes the kind of driving force, it also becomes the narrative for the project. And as the docents and salespeople move around this space, they're actually able to talk about how that data is part of the kind of design process. But while that happens, it's still this kind of iconic imagery, which really sells what IBM is all about, or what Watson is all about. And so here you can see some of the images of the completed installation in San Francisco. This is a more recent project which we just completed last year. It's a medical hospital, or a pediatric neurologist office in Orange County here in Southern California, just south of Los Angeles. It's a project that we're really trying to challenge in this case, the kind of agony of the banal, like really rethinking what a hospital waiting room could be like, and thinking of it as something that becomes more playful, more fun, and more engaging, but particularly for a demographic which is children that have neurological disorders. So children that are really stimulated by the combinations of color and texture, and thinking about it as a place for relaxation rather than a place for boredom, and taking on some ideas that are about thickness and really how you can work with thickness. And so the space is really defined by these 4 bay windows. We really tried to capture those bay windows at the starting point. And these are some original early studies to think about how we could kind of carve out those windows into kind of occupiable poche, a term that I like to think about as thinking of the thickness of something as a chance to create a kind of intermediate space. So here we have the plan arrangement of the doctor's office. But what's important is not just that the plan arrangement as a kind of distribution of program, but it's actually a distribution of process. And so what we see here in terms of these different programs is really a separation of program into the pink, which is the patient area, the blue, which is the examination area, and the cyan, which is the medical or doctor area. And what this kind of does is it almost creates it like an airport, where you have a kind of airside, landside configuration, which liberates the doctors at the back in that pink, in the cyan area, to be able to move from room to room without being disturbed by the patients that are waiting. And it means that the patients that are waiting can actually go straight into the rooms and have a kind of more lounge-like atmosphere through this extended waiting area. And so here we have the kind of more rationalized version of the design that you saw previously. Everything has a series of CNC etched cuts, all done with a CNC zoomed cutter. So it's a rotating blade. And this kind of friction blade is able to cut at different angles and remove material out of this rigid felt, which is normally an acoustic felt used for ceilings. We used it here as a finished material. This diagram shows the kind of varying depths of the cuts that are being produced, and then the coating of the pieces as it's being manufactured. And then here we see the doctor's office. We have the reception desk in the front. All of the geometry is actually, the subtle geometric moves are actually all ADA requirements. So all of the kind of cuts into the bottom and then the drop on the left are all responding to handicap requirements, so that we can get wheelchairs to roll up to the desk and be able to have accessible reception. And then, as you can see, the seating areas get carved out of those windows, and the space gets filled with natural light. It's also interesting to note that the feature wall is a CT scan of a human brain. As a pediatric neurology center, we wanted to produce something that was abstract, but referenced what was going on. Here we see the kind of view down to the back, where there's a series of toys, and then the kind of entrances into the different examination rooms. and then the detailing of that acoustic felt. So the acoustic felt and then the combination of the color and acoustic felt makes it really fun. I think one of the interesting things that has happened now is that the doctor's office, one of their new problems is that patients don't like to leave. So the children actually, after their appointments, end up trying to use the waiting area as a playground, which I guess is a pretty good, problem to have. Whereas before they had the problem of people not wanting to be there. Now the problem is they can't get the kids to leave. Each of the different waiting or examination rooms is coded with a different color, so that patients are instructed to go to a room by color rather than by number. And then here you see the kind of circulation corridor where the doctor is able to move between exam room to exam room without being disturbed by the patients that are waiting. And then some of the textures that are involved in this, from the texture of the felt to the feature wall to the embedded capillary system in the storage wall. So the storage wall has this perspex, or it's acrylic capillary system that creates these kind of glowing doors, although the lighting is behind the doors. And so you get this kind of really beautiful dappled effect through those doors. Another really important position that the office has is this idea that geometry can be defined by relationships rather than dimensions, and that geometric logic is really kind of the underlying ethos of a lot of the work that we do. This is a project that we did in Bangkok, in CentralWorld. For those of you who have ever been to Bangkok or that are from there, I don't know if anybody here is in Bangkok now. CentralWorld is very, very, very big. It is the world's third largest mall. It is nearly 600,000 square meters of shopping, retail, lifestyle, restaurants, offices, hotels, hospitals, movie theaters, grocery stores, metro stations, etc. And so you can see here the site is very big, and it's on Planchet Road, which is very, very intense. It might be best described as like the Oxford Street of Bangkok. And there is our site, and you can see that on that site we have two approaches from the office tower there, which is actually where our clients' offices are located, and then one approach from the shopping mall on the right, creating this opportunity for these two sort of atrium spaces. But rather than think about the atrium space as something that is carved out of a singular mass, we wanted to think of it more as like something that was a courtyard between multiple buildings. And so the way we thought of our project is as this kind of assembly of buildings that created a courtyard space an outdoor courtyard space between them. But what was important was when we did this process, we actually started working on this parametric model to kind of discover the opportunities for different configurations. But then more importantly, we sat with our client and actually put this into a live feed with Microsoft Excel and connected it to their pro forma. So they were actually real time able to see how our design decisions or design changes were affecting their pro forma and their return on investment. And this really allowed us to kind of engage with them in a way that made them feel like what our kind of design decisions were not just about our own design aspirations, they were also about our clients' return on investment. So this diagram here talks about the kind of circulation spaces as they move through the project, and how the kind of flows of traffic on the Planchet roadside carve away at the mass and reveal these spaces internally. We talk a lot about how the interior of the space is an oasis away from that intensity, but then that oasis reveals itself in this kind of little sliver of flesh around the perimeter. And then we have this highly intense perforated aluminum facade that kind of tries to capture the intensity of traffic along Planchet Road, into all of it backlit. Here we have the final images or photographs of the project. So you can see here the primary entrance from Planchet Road, and the beautiful landscaping done by our partners at Trop Designs. And then at night, those fleshy reveals are backlit and you get this kind of glowing effect and the kind of light coming through the perforated aluminum rain screen. We have our two internal and external courtyard areas. The one on the right is actually a retractable fabric ceiling, so it opens up to be an external space. Then you see some of the detailing of the aluminum facade here, and then the kind of timber trim that lines it. And then the internal spaces with the CNC milled soffits of the ceiling above, and then the integrated landscaping on this external courtyard. This next project is a project which we're working on right now. It's under construction in Yongding, China. It's very, very large. It's a 2,000 seat performance hall and 80 key boutique hotel in Yongding, China. Yongding, China is a very unique place. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, home of 20,000 of these, the Tulo rammed earth houses, which are about 500 to 750 years old. Each of these homes is the home of a clan of the Hakka minority, which come from northern China and fled to southern China, and built these kind of protective, introverted homes as a way to protect themselves as minority groups from those that are in the area as well. They've now become a UNESCO World Heritage Site and become a huge tourist destination. And so our project is an attempt to kind of convert this area into a larger tourist area with a performance hall and a boutique hotel. And so the approach we took was trying to consider the traditional Hakka and its kind of introverted form and its, let's say, autonomous relationship to the site, where it doesn't really have a true relationship to the context. It just works like a flying saucer kind of dropped onto the landscape. We really wanted to rethink that and kind of sculpt the landscape to receive the object and then introvert and flip the object open. So it moves from becoming this kind of introverted form to becoming an extroverted form and becomes something that peels out of the landscape and focuses on these dramatic views over the river and back towards the other Tulo in the area. So here you can see the project in the renderings of it sitting on its kind of hilltop site overlooking the river. What you can see above is that we have the performance hall at the top. At the bottom, we have the rooms of the hotel embedded into the landscape. And then in between, we have the retail / hotel lobby in the middle of that sandwich. All of this is driven by a parametric model. So starting from the bottom, we have the kind of spiraling circulation of the circulation into the performance hall. What you can see is that the seating and the stage is in the middle, which means it's theater in the round, and that the performers actually come from outside and enter the stage through that spiraling ramp. And the spiraling ramp allows the entire crowd to have the performers, as they enter, get a kind of view of them passing through. Then the parametric model also calibrates to control the seating heights so that everybody gets a good view. And then another parametric model on top of that drives the structural condition, which is driven by the kind of perimeter lines of the roofing system above, which is converted into a series of rational arcs. Those rational arcs then allow us to be able to highlight to our constructors, our contractor, the exact dimensions and positions and center points of each of those arcs, which were converted from the freeform geometry. Here we have a non-digitally fabricated physical model. So this is made by hand in China, of course. And then here we have some of the construction photographs of the project in progress. And this last chapter I have here is called Informed Form, and really is something that has motivated me for quite some time. And it's this idea about conform, follow, performance. Thinking about the fact that, when I first started working, I used to after I graduated from the AA, I went to work for Zaha Hadid Architects and spent a lot of time working on very, very extravagant projects with very large budgets. And then after that, I went to Future Systems and then Amanda Labide Architects, where I became a director. And all of those places, I was working on these kind of mega projects with huge budgets. And then 2008 happened. And 2008 gave me a chance to really rethink the role of form and thinking about how form had to be justified by more than form itself. And so one of the things that really motivated me was thinking about the work of people like Fry Otto or Pierluigi Nervi, Felix Candela, these great structural engineer, architects, designers that really thought of form as a form of performance. And in this case, looking at Fry Otto's minimal surface experiments with soap film and aluminum, how the form of the geometry actually comes from the inherent material performance in producing these minimal surface structures that were able to span huge spans with super minimal lightweight structures. And the way that Fry was working on these and form finding in a physical or analog manner, we were now able to do through things like Grasshopper and Kangaroo, and looking at kind of particle systems as a way to think about how we can produce something known as dynamic mesh relaxation, which would help us find things like catenary curves or catenary meshes or inflated structures, or in this case, producing catalogs of known minimal surfaces. And producing these catalogs of known minimal surfaces actually gave us an opportunity to kind of develop this intuition on how to work with this, that when this competition came about, which was a competition by Volvo, it was a real opportunity for us to kind of rethink how to apply these things. So this competition was for a pavilion to showcase this, which is the Volvo V60, a plug-in hybrid electric diesel car. The requirements for the competition were that it was an international competition, about 250 entries from around the world. Here you see some of the 10 shortlisted projects. The requirements were that the project had to be demountable within 1 day, erectable within 1 day, and showcase the three modes of the car, and fit inside a shipping container. And so as you can see, most of the proposals were to produce some form of, let's call it a prefabricated garage. And what we were thinking was if a garage is a destination, maybe we could actually think of the project not as a destination, something that the car would travel to, but more like an accessory, something that the car would travel with, like a backpack. And in this case, since the car was electric, we thought maybe if you were to carry a backpack with that car, you would want it to be an electric backpack, a backpack that could actually charge the car. And so in the end, this is what we were able to produce. But the initial idea was that we would have this pavilion that was 3 points on the ground, 3 points up in the sky, that would symbolize the three modes of operation: hybrid, electric, and diesel. The entire thing would be manufactured out of a bending active perimeter frame made out of carbon fiber rods and a stretched nylon membrane. The carbon fiber rods could be bent into position and would want to spring open, but would be held into place by the nylon membrane, and that the combination of those two things, the bending active frame against the tensioned skin, would find an equilibrium and it would hold its form, but would allow it to be disassembled and erected much like a tent. We worked on this both in digital modeling and simulation, as well as in physical modeling and simulation, and then worked with our structural engineers to produce the kind of form finding and the structural analysis. All of this done by Bureau Happelt in Los Angeles. I think one of the interesting things here is we're working with Kangaroo and Grasshopper, obviously fairly accessible and affordable platforms, while our engineers, Bureau Happelt, were working with a software program called Endian Membrane, which is about $36,000 a license. I think one of the interesting facts about this competition that really was important to us was that where we were working with a free plugin for Grasshopper and Kangaroo Rhino being quite accessible as a program itself. They were intent on saying that our form finding was inaccurate and that only their form finding was accurate. In the end, our form finding and their form finding had about a 2% delta, which, for a free program, I'm actually quite happy with. But at the same time, I think it's important to note that, we're not signing off on the liability. So their accuracy is far more important than ours. We also had to move away from the bent carbon fiber, and because of the cost, and had to move towards a CNC bent aluminum frame. When we first did the quote for the CNC bent aluminum frame, it was so expensive and so out of range for our budget. I sat down and talked to the fabricator and realized that asked him to show me how they were costing this. And what he said is they take our freeform perimeter frame, break it up into rational arcs, program the machine for each arc, run that arc, stop the machine, reprogram it for the next arc, run it again, stop it, run it again, stop it, run it again, stop it. And I asked him, okay, so how many arcs do we have? And he said somewhere around 5,000. So I realized that was the real problem. I asked him to give me a week. In a week, we came back with a new parametric model, had converted all of our 5,000 rational arcs into 5 repeating arcs, and was able to get our budget into the proper range. We also produced a solar incidence analysis for the Pavilion for 365 days of the year for 360 degrees of rotation over 8 hours of the day, so we could find the areas of the greatest solar incidence to allow us to identify where to place the solar panels. All of this is unrolled, kind of like a tailoring of suits, and unrolled into flat sheets and flat parts and stitched together. Here we see the CNC pipe bending of the aluminum frame, and then that assembly. All of the ends are swaged and fit together, much like a tent. And then we have 2 pieces of nylon membrane with a zipper down the middle, and then a zipper around the perimeter with a neoprene sleeve to fit over the tube. This was our first test fit, which took about 45 minutes. I don't know why, but no matter how many times we do it again, it always ends up at 45 minutes. And here we have the final Pavilion. So the Pavilion, in the end, was quite successful. We were able to get it so that it basically is able to be assembled within 45 minutes. It fits inside the trunk of the car. It charges the car in about 8 hours. This will be the last physical project I show you here. This is a project. This is a competition we didn't win. If you follow us on Instagram, there's a hashtag, another failed competition, which aggregates a lot of our work. We've entered a lot of competitions. We've lost most of them. And this is one of the many that we've lost. Not ironically, I guess, for a Chinese competition, we actually placed first, but did not win. But this project is in Guangzhou. It's an invited competition. There were 9 other offices. And we were really inspired by these cultural phenomenon known as scholars' rocks, these rocks that are from Guangzhou, that are sculpted by rivers and collected by scholars. And we really thought about how the kind of narrative behind these rocks was something that we could latch onto in terms of thinking of this tower as a kind of condition that mirrored a lot of the kind of general assumptions about these rocks as kind of microcosms of the world through their asymmetric formation, through their caves and their dimpled surfaces. They were always kind of thought about in Chinese mythology as microcosms of the world. And a world, in this case, we wanted to think about as the kind of embedded world of this headquarters, and that they were more than an object. They were this kind of world that occupied this space. And here we see an image of one of the kind of famous scholars' rocks. We take the original kind of default master plan of the single tower and low rise, adjust it with the kind of desired massing of the competition, merge the two volumes, begin puncturing them, and then adjusting the heights. So in the end, in the pink, we have the distribution of the kind of penthouse and headquarters office, and then the lettable areas of the blue below that, and then the conference center below that. This diagram kind of talks about the kind of qualities of the scholars' rocks, which are appreciated by Chinese scholars, whether it is about their asymmetry and their slimness, or about the kind of dimpled, wrinkled surfaces on the kind of exterior, or the kind of internal caves and perforations, which signify the other worlds of occupation. But then convert those things into more meaningful or pragmatic solutions, whether it's again becoming these kind of solar louvers, which are horizontal at the north and south elevations to deal with the kind of more vertical northern or southern sun, and then more diagonal at the east and west elevations to deal with a more lateral east-west sun. And then a series of sky gardens and linear gardens that line the perimeter, clubhouses and penthouses at the top, and sky bridges in the middle, all of which produce opportunities for natural ventilation and the integration of landscape. And then those solar louvers at the perimeter also help us get to about 75% solar reduction on the facade. And here you see the louvers and the kind of diagram of the internal spaces. And then we also took this project and put our drawings into AR. AR is something we're quite interested in terms of its ability to, interrogate or experience an architectural model in a way, or an architectural drawing in a way that feels quite natural. And so here you see some videos of us kind of placing our model into right above our on the roof of our office here in downtown Los Angeles. Whereas VR, I think, is something that is quite unnatural for a lot of people, like walking around and stumbling. Holding a phone and navigating around something has become second nature to pretty much everybody on the planet. And it's become something that actually really extends the way you can experience something in a highly intuitive and highly natural way. Here you see it, the same model at the Bradbury Building in Los Angeles. In the middle, one of our interns took it to on holiday with her to Las Vegas. So that's at her pool at her hotel. I think the real interest in technology and in architecture really is, as I said in the beginning, a cultural one. And this is a really important quote for me. And this is where, in the beginning, Riyad talked a little bit about, would I be taking this talk anywhere that was addressing some of the current events? And this is something that really is an opportunity, I think, that has come up right now, where we're all experiencing this pandemic and we're all dealing with the kind of global situation right now of systematic racism being not something that has emerged, but let's say something that finally has been rightfully exposed, and something that we're all facing. Instability of culture becomes the opportunity to redefine it. And one of the ways we can react as architects, or we have here at USC and in Los Angeles, is through Operation PPE, where we've converted our expertise and ability to 3D print into this network in Southern California. We have a volunteer network that is now 3D printing PPE throughout Southern California. We have 329 volunteers and 250 3D printers from 15 plus academic institutions and 50 plus architecture firms, printing for various hospitals. This is just some of the many firms and schools that are working with us. And we're doing this in a way that now, to be honest, now the need has intensified a little bit. Now that the situation with the PPE, at least in Los Angeles, has gotten better, though the situation with the virus hasn't necessarily gotten better, although we are opening up again, which I'm not quite, happy with altogether on my own. But I think it really shows the opportunity that we have as architects to leverage our abilities and our ways of thinking almost like a weapon, and the things that we can point it at. And I think this is an opportunity now where, let's say, what's going on with architecture and culture becomes an opportunity for us to rethink and redefine what we're doing, much the way this car did. Or let's say there's a point in time where this car was known as a horseless carriage. And we were talking about the horseless carriage as something that had evolved from a carriage with a horse, and you remove the horse, but the proportions of the carriage stayed the same. But some of those proportions were unnecessary. Right now that you didn't have a horse, there was no reason for the carriage to be in a position where it could see past or over a horse. So the modern version of the car shrank, it got lower, the dimensions changed, the ergonomics changed, and it became something altogether. And we forgot that the horse ever existed. Right now, we are also in a moment where we oftentimes like to think about the type of work that I do and a lot of the work that Riyad has been organizing for this as digital architecture. And I think it's a little bit silly to think of it that way, because in a less than a generation, there will be no other way of working on architecture other than digitally. And so we really want to think about it in other terms. So in the end, I think that's where I'll end it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alvin. So we have some questions here, and I wouldn't spend too much time asking you a question, although I had one in mind, but let's give that time to the audience. Yasmin Atum is asking, how do you measure the heat performance of the Watson wall on site? Which material was used to construct it as well? So it's a two-part question.
So which one, the Watson?
The IBM wall, your project.
So the IBM wall was, the outer perimeter is CNC cold rolled stainless steel. Mm-hmm. Then the inner layer is a cold formed, so basically bent into place, super thin, I think it was 22 gauge aluminum that's laser cut.
Mm-hmm. And coated, I'd assume, powder coated white.
Yes, no, that one is coated, but it's I forgot the name of the coating. It's similar to a dichroic coat, but it gives it a kind of really high sheen metallic finish that leaves fingerprints. So what happens is by putting it as an inner layer, you protect it to keep it from getting those fingerprints. Right. But also because it's not rolled, it's actually bent into place. It's difficult to achieve the tangencies, but it makes it really cheap. What you don't have to worry about the tangencies because they're covered up by the outer layer, which has the tangencies. Mm-hmm. So the inner layer actually becomes a little bit faceted. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the dual layers gives it the moire effect of the backlighting and the kind of visual space.
Yeah, and that's a super interesting sort of phenomena with that piece of work. Especially it's really dynamic as you move around it, because it's almost a cylindrical form, so it works perfectly with that. So we have another question from Ramzi here for the pediatric clinic. Now that we have lived with COVID-19, would you have designed that space any different now, knowing that COVID-19 has changed everything, mainly with sanitary requirements? And the second part is not including invited competitions. What is your best source to build or competitions for basically that is work to be built?
Sorry, what was the question about? Which project were they talking about with COVID?
The first question was about the clinic that you've designed, the pediatric clinic. His question about the sanitary requirements that may have changed through,
Right. So obviously now I think the bigger issue with a place like that would be that felt, right, which is difficult to protect in this current environment. So yeah, I think in the current environment, I don't think we would have used that felt in that same way. Although the felt still does serve the kind of tactile requirements as well as the acoustic requirements. But I think now, I suspect in the future, we're going to see a lot more projects that have an emphasis on copper and brass as a finish because of its microbial, antimicrobial performative qualities. I think that's something that we'll see a lot more in the future. But I do think that the sanitary requirements are something that is going to affect the if not the long-term future, for sure the immediate future.
I mean, also, what I found interesting about that project is that you mentioned a lot of the detailing is not there just to have an interesting form or to it's not just a design decision, or not just a formal decision, but a very pragmatic decision to, for example, leave more space for a wheelchair to come closer to the reception desk. So I'd assume some of these decisions will also be influenced by the situation. For example, some of the seating arrangements and how far people should be from each other and so on and so forth. Right. So the other question was about not including invited competitions. How do you find work for built, so basically invitations for work that is to be built? Do clients approach you, or are there some sort of competitions that you look up that you are sure that it could lead into something that can be built?
If I knew I had a consistent answer for that, I think I'd be in a better position than I am. But yeah, yeah, I would say the one thing that I have come to realize is that all of the work I've ever gotten, in the end, has come through some form of relationship.
Right.
Whether or not it was a direct relationship is different, but whether it is a friend of a friend or somebody who heard of me through somebody else, or I've had almost nothing that has come through pure nowhere.
Right. So it's almost word of mouth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the one thing that I can say that is hyper clear to me, the older I get, right, like the longer I've been doing this, is that what we do is not like a lot of other things, right? Like you're willing to go buy a brand of clothing that you've never heard of before just because you like it, right? Because the risk is very low,
right?
But if you're talking about having a 2 to 3 year relationship with somebody that's going to be spending $20 million of your money to give you something that's going to last you for 25, 30 years, if not forever, that might be a legacy of your name. Relationship means a lot, and your ability to get along with that person, and your ability to trust that person, and your ability to have some form of, let's call it some form of being able to understand where that person came from, or some sort of accountability on that end. And so I've found that what has helped me the most with finding new work is actually developing more relationships. And so that's actually one of the more recent things that I've tried to focus on, is maybe spending less of my time talking to my architect friends. Not that I don't appreciate them, but like I used to spend a lot of time networking with other architects. And I suddenly realized that networking with other architects, maybe they helped me get things like this, like more talks. But more talks, I've never had a project come out of a talk, ever. Like all I will ever get. I mean, maybe this one. Hopefully it changes today. Maybe next time I will be flying to Dubai sometime to do some new project. But
I would be glad to have you here, definitely. Anonymous is asking, do you offer any internships for graduates?
Oh, absolutely. We have interns all the time. I have a lot of. Currently have 2 interns in the office. Well, I guess in the office is the wrong term right now. Like 2 interns that are working remotely. Which right now it's weird because one of them's on the East Coast, so like she joins every day at her lunchtime, and when we finish every day, it's like totally dark on her end. But yeah, we definitely have internships, and if you're interested in an internship, I will drop a email into the chat right now.
And maybe, Alvin, also another silver lining is now you can hire interns from all over the world, because it's become second nature to work online.
Yeah.
So we have a question here that's almost an entire conversation. Faisal, would you like to go on camera to ask this question? We'd love to have you ask it live if you're because it would just take too long to read it. I'd rather you read it to Alvin, and I'll move on to the question. Faisal, if you'd like to go on live, please use the raise hand tool so that the host can find you, and I'll ask for you to be promoted. Abdullah is asking, how will events like concerts and other crowded space events or other crowded spaces will take place with social distancing, in your opinion? So how do you see these events, these big gatherings of people? How would architecture in a way influence that, given the post-pandemic era that we will be experiencing?
I think that's still yet to be seen. I think we don't know enough yet about what's going to happen. I mean, I think the major reality, I think, is that most people are waiting for the vaccine, and that we've let's say this is the first time it's happened in history that it's happened on this scale, but also to this awareness. Whereas, like, let's say, never in history have we been this physically and digitally connected, so that we're actually aware of everything that's happening everywhere at the same time, but also that the spread of something like this can happen because of the ability for global travel, right? So things like this have happened before, whether it's smallpox or polio or the Spanish flu, the Black Plague. There's been illnesses that have been, totally fatal, that have been spread very easily, and that have eventually, gone away. Not because they've actually gone away, but because we've been able to come up with vaccines. But they've never spread the way they have now because we didn't have global travel the way that we do now.
Right.
But we've also never been aware of them.
Yeah.
The way that we are now, because we're,
science
is doing now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment, and going back to those illnesses that you mentioned, I don't recall a moment in architecture where architecture was influenced in a way, like where we started building our environments differently because of the plague.
Well, that's not true. So, like, if you look at, like, from Victorian times, the introduction of like public spaces and squares, and kind of Victoria Park was built for that purpose. Victoria Park in East London was built to respond to the plague because there was not enough public space on the east end of London, where it was, like, actually the worst. And then if you look at modernism is also a response to trying to, let's say, centralize certain functions, and from an urbanist standpoint of segregating the city into residential areas, commercial areas, industrial areas, agricultural areas, to essentially create a machine that could allow each function to operate cleanly, to separate, factories from houses and all of these things. And so what is interesting is in things like, say, the role of modernism in that aspect may have solved one problem but created another, right? In the sense of, like then you needed cars, then you had lost the ability to, like, let's say, America as a civilization or a culture that was coming out of post-modernism, right? Like, meaning it was invented after the invention of the car, was designed around the car, and now you have American neighborhoods where to go buy a gallon of milk, you literally have to drive 5 miles just to leave a sea of houses.
Interesting.
Which has a different impact on the environment.
Very interesting. The sort of some of the examples that you mentioned. I was not aware that of these examples before, that were kind of responses to plays before in the past. So let's promote Faisal so that he can ask his question. And Alvin, I hope that we're not holding you back from starting your day. How much time do we have together? I mean,
I can do like another 15 minutes.
Cool. So Faisal, maybe we'll promote. Host, can you please promote Faisal? And if you can go on camera, Faisal, you're joining us, I believe, from Dubai. Your mic is.
Yes. Hi, Riyad. Hi.
Hey.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing good.
I recognize you from Instagram.
Yes. I'm actually going to be interviewing you on Wednesday, so I thought I'd sort of tune into your talk. And it was absolutely
interview now, Faisal. Is that why you've typed such a long question?
I've actually, like, I began sort of thinking about that since the beginning of the talk, because it's like I feel like the sort of avant-garde architecture is moving towards one of two ways. It's either moving towards sort of architects becoming programmers, or architects becoming sort of pre-Renaissance master builders. So I just wanted to sort of ask your opinion on that. Do you think we're going to sort of become proto-designers, where we're going to be less involved in specifics of designing, and we're going to be more like coders and programmers and sort of in charge of parameters? Or are we going to go sort of the Gaudi way of sort of pre-Renaissance master builders, where we do concepts, design, fabrication, assembly, and sort of curate the whole process as a whole?
I think that in some ways it's a little bit of both. Like I think one of the issues of being an architect in general is that you're almost forced to be a jack of all trades and master of none. Right. And so that to be a true programmer, like to really be in the guts or in the weeds of programming, means that you're so far deep into it that you might lose track of other things, or you're like, there's very few humans that have the capacity to be expert at many things, like many things. And I think, myself included, I am definitely not a master programmer, master coder, nor a master fabricator. But I think I'm dangerous enough at all of them that I can at least understand how they work. And so I can, understand the opportunities that might be there. And I think if you look at, like, let's just say, if you look at the most successful technology companies in the world, they're not being run by programmers, right? And they're not, like, the programmers are doing magic, but the magic is not in the, like I stated in the beginning, the magic is actually not in the answer. The magic was in the question, right? Like the question being, why is that an important thing to do, or what is important about that? And so I am firmly interested in computation as part of that equation, and believe that there's actually no way of separating it. I think architecture has always been informed by technology, whether you're thinking about the mass production of glass and steel that created, modernism, or you're talking about, Brunelleschi inventing perspective and designing through perspective, like which is also a form of technology. Those are all things that have produced it, but at the same time, the things that make it exceptional are not the technological inventions. The technological inventions set the stage and create the opportunity, but the real, let's say, moment is when somebody can use those things and leverage those things to tackle something more important, or tackle something more pressing. And I think I think it's not a coincidence that, let's say, the avant-garde that we often talk about in architecture, in terms of the archograms and the super studios and Peter Cook and David Green and all this, Cedric Price, happened in the 1960s at a moment when, let's say, the technology of architecture and the culture of architecture were working at a moment when it was actually difficult to produce architecture, but there was major social, cultural, technological issues that were at hand in the world that we could point those things at. And I think this is one of the, I've been talking about this a lot recently, which is context. And I think context is one of the things that, we learn about oftentimes as architects as, like, the number one thing to design around. But what we don't ever talk about is context beyond physical. And right now we have a context beyond physical that is historic, right? And I don't think it's any coincidence. Like, if you look at literally any creative or intellectual act, whether it's filmmaking, writing books, creating art, that you can identify a kind of social, political, intellectual context through which that book was written in, right? As it took place at a particular moment in time and is informed by that. And you see that in movies, you see that in, like Blade Runner, for instance. 1984, but positioned itself as 2019. Actually, November last year was Blade Runner, the original Blade Runner. But it was written in the 80s, which meant that its projection of 2019 was one which positioned like the world spoke Japanese, which at that time Japan was rising as a world superpower. It was the rise of corporate America at that time, and so the whole world was taken over by the Tyrell Corporation and was, driven by one corporation. It was the kind of rise of like computation, and so they started talking about cyborgs, and it was all a mechanism for critiquing the present through projecting the future. And I think that's actually one of the things I think I'm starting to, I have to say in more recent years, becoming more political and more socially conscious in the work that I'm doing and thinking about it in those ways. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, I saw Prabhat Aurora asked me a question about my dislike of Trump. And I think Trump's, let's say, existence in the front office of the United States of America, or Brexit, or you name it, the number of issues that the world is facing right now in terms of our right-wing leaders has really, let's say, struck a chord in other ways, right? So if you look at filmmaking, or all the same disciplines I just talked about, whether it's architecture, design, filmmaking, music, all of them have become far more political and more socially conscious in the last 6 years, right? Like all of them, that's maybe one of the good things that has happened, right? So like because of that, like you literally in the United States cannot have a search for a dean at a university and have a short list of 3 white men. Like you will have complete upheaval. Like everybody will go at you if you put together a short list of 3 white men for one position, and you say, I didn't even consider one minority, one woman, one. But if you were to go before Trump, probably would have been okay. And now because of Trump, these, and I know I'm getting a little bit off track here, but I think the way I think of like the coding, the fabrication, the programming, all of these things is their weapons. And they are things that you can become highly, highly skilled at. But if you don't know what you're using them, what you're using them to attack and for what purpose, a parallel example I always give is, Top Gun. You might be a little bit young to remember that movie, but I think Riyad might remember Top Gun.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And in Top Gun, I always talk about Top Gun related to architecture in the sense that I think there's kind of relationship between the dogfight and design, and like when the best students at Top Gun end up teaching at Top Gun, which happens a lot in architectural academia. The best students don't go practice, they go teach. Because if they go practice, then they're doing things like what you would in the military, right? Like if you go actually into the military, then you're not dogfighting every day. You're running patrols, you're doing drills, you're like doing all these things that are actually what the real military is like. But we're so fascinated in architecture, in design, and let's say the dogfight. We just want to run the dogfight over and over and over again, even though we might be doing dogfights that are not advancing a war or not advancing a battle, right? And I guess the more I keep thinking about it is like, how do I? And a lot of this is just me getting older, I guess. Is like I'm still interested in the dogfight. I'm hyper interested in the dogfight, but I'm becoming more interested into why I'm fighting that fight, or what the means of that dogfight produces.
Absolutely. Alvin, we have so many questions here, and thank you again for your question. Maybe you'd leave material for his interview as well. So that but that was a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Alvin.
Welcome.
See you on Wednesday.
Welcome. All right.
Thank you. Thanks, Riyad.
Actually, so I'm sorry. I don't even remember what's Wednesday.
Okay, so we're having an Instagram live interview on Wednesday on all of Arky's Instagram. I'll DM you the details.
Okay.
You can drop it in the chat as well so that the other attendees could join as well.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you so much. Thanks, Riyad.
Thank you.
Adamus is asking, what's your advice of how architects can use Instagram to attract opportunities? It's very interesting that you started your talk with talking about Instagram and the Instagram culture and its kind of its implications on our current contemporary culture. So how can we use Instagram to attract opportunities? Should architects prepare speculative work for promoting what they're interested in doing and putting it out on Instagram to see if a client would kind of catch that bait in a way?
I don't think you can ever use it for the purpose of trying to literally attract clients directly unless you're doing work that is, let's say, more focused on residential interiors. I think residential interiors, I think there is that opportunity.
Yeah.
Because I think quite a lot of people use social media to kind of discover what they want, like whether it's like choosing shoes or choosing a bed. But I think what I'm interested in Instagram is more that it gives you a window into understanding the way somebody else views the world, right? Because that's why I'm more interested in personal Instagrams than I am in professional Instagrams, because personal Instagrams give window into the lens through which somebody views the world. Like what they post tells you what they prioritize, what they're interested in, what their focuses are, good and bad. Like I have to admit, when I prepare for interviews with interns and employees, like I oftentimes will check social media for their names, and there's literally been times where I'm like, oh, this person's a little bit self-centered. Pass. Right? Like I don't need to have somebody who just posts selfies of themselves. No offense to anybody out there who posts a lot of selfies, but I mean, I think that's the real opportunity I would see in that. And I don't know that, like I said, it's never happened to me yet. I have been approached on Instagram for people interested, but literally every time it's been somebody who has zero idea of what it takes to hire an architect,
right?
And thinks that you can do it for think they're hiring a plumber.
Anonymous is asking, can you speak a little bit more about the intuitive designs or sort of your intuition being computed in a way through some of your design ideas? And we've seen a lot of really amazing examples of how you put some design ideas as part of the process, as part of the kind of the computation of these designs. So Anonymous is asking if you can speak very briefly about that.
I mean, I guess it just goes back to what I was saying about the technology, technique, Techne kind of chart or evolution. And Techne, I think you can't reach that moment. Like the example I gave of John Coltrane, like you can't reach that. Like Coltrane was able to think or, react intuitively with the techniques that he had at his disposal. But that means that he's perfected them or perfected their like, it's like drawing, right? If you haven't mastered a technique or way of drawing, it's very difficult to let it flow out of you. And maybe to be super cheesy and go back into my 80s movie reserve, like thinking about Karate Kid and, like the kind of repetition of an act that suddenly just comes out when it needs to.
Was that the moment where he caught the fly with the chopsticks? I still remember that movie. Okay. Anonymous saying, great presentation and work. We are taught not to really use literal inspiration to create a concept for our building, but rather use a more abstract representation. What are your thoughts about that?
I would agree on that, except when it comes to Chinese clients.
Right. Or clients in the Middle East. I mean, we have the
So you have to understand who you're speaking to, right? And so like if you saw the literal, when I used the literal representations in the presentation, it was always a Chinese client. And there's certain client bases, or let's say you have to understand who you're selling to.
Yeah.
Right. And if to do something really interesting in certain places, goes back to that comment about novelty and effects. Novelty is only useful when it has effect, like it can connect with somebody. And in the case of that literal inspiration, it works when it can connect.
Yeah, that's
but when it doesn't connect is when it's like, oh, the building is shaped like a wave because it's by the water.
Right.
Yeah. Because then you're like, okay, there's no connection. It's just literal metaphor.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I'm sure you've shown some incredible examples of that, but I think you might agree that while you're leading your own practice, your major goal becomes to attract these interesting projects, these projects that could be profitable for your business at the end of the day. And sometimes there's a bit of a sacrifice to give, where you'd have to be politically aware of how these projects are maneuvered through and how to get the sign off. And I thought actually the reference that you've had for that last project for the competition that you've won was actually a really nice way to go about doing that. So you almost become a master at this dialogue as well with the client, and balancing between what your aspirations are and actually winning the project.
Okay. Sorry, Riyad. I think I'm going to have to end it here.
So, do you have any last words for our audience or for Live Academy? And thanks again for joining us, Alvin. This was an incredible talk. It is recorded and will be broadcasted on our YouTube channel. So we'll send everybody the link soon. Thanks again, Alvin, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, well, I just want to say thank you, Riyad. It's a pleasure to be connected with you again. And, I hope everybody out there stays safe and, does their best in this current situation. We are all in this together. And I will say that, as architects, designers, and particularly as students right now, I think what we really want to be thinking about is how this particular moment is actually an opportunity for us not to go back to normal, but actually rethink what normal is. Like, in some ways, I would say it's, I have a potential client right now who, very unfortunate set of circumstances, but they, during the pandemic, had a fire in their house, and their house burned down on the ground floor. And so now I'm coming to look at the house, and because they had this fire and are rebuilding the house, their goal is, what we're talking about is not to rebuild the house, but actually take this as the opportunity to rethink all the things that bothered them about the previous house.
Interesting.
Right? Because if you have to rebuild, why rebuild exactly the same way if you knew there were problems? Right? And we know there were problems. And we now have a chance to go back and define what this next version of the world is post-pandemic. Let's try to fix them.
Great. And that's a great note to end this talk on. Thanks again, Alvin, for joining us from LA. Thanks to our audience, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much. Take care.